we have our geocode function mocked and working in a local Firebase function. Next up, we have a second API that we have to emulate or mimic right now, and that is the places nearby search request. Currently, we have a bunch of mock information from this API in a certain shape that mimics it that we are returning to our application. But now we want to integrate this. But before we integrate it, we want to also move our mock into our Firebase function so that we can prove that our app continues to work and move the request into the Firebase function that acts like a server locally. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, first off, we need to go over here into our functions folder and we need to go to our index. And over here, you see exports.geocode. Now, this is what is releasing a geocode function over here. If we look at our functions, we have a geocode that will be executed. Okay, so we're going to create a second function and we're going to call it places nearby. Now, places nearby is what's going to give us the ability to basically do a places request. So we're going to create a places request. And this is going to come from /places. So we need to create a places folder. And once we create a places folder, we'll create an index file inside of that places folder and we'll module.exports.places request. And that's going to take in request and response. And now we can do response.send places request. Once we do this, what we can do is we can go over to our terminal and we can see here places nearby has been released. Now, if we go down here, we can see that functions index, etc. We were unable to load your code because they cannot find the module places. So places.index, index here. Let's just quickly reload. And then let's reload over here. And we can see that it has, in fact, loaded now. So if we go to this URL, what we're going to see is here is our placeholder for our places request. Now that we have our placeholder for our places request, well, the next thing we need to do is we need to go look at how we were doing our request originally. Originally, our restaurant request was a request that was just taking the mocks and the mock images from mock. Okay, so let's get rid of this. We know that we're going to need this, but let's get rid of this code. And then let's remove the mock folder. And let's move the mock folder all the way up to the places folder. And we're going to need to do some massaging to the information that's in here. First of all of these imports need to become requires because the node cannot understand import, but it does understand require. So we're going to change it all to be require. So now that we're requiring Antwerp JSON, Chicago JSON, we're going to change the JSON files to be just regular old JavaScript files because that's a bit easier to understand for Node. And we'll do module.exports.mocks over here. And we're going to just leave this as const mocks for now because we're going to do something interesting. Now what we need to do is we need to change our JSON file to actually be a JavaScript file. So we're going to rename every single one of them to .js. And once we do that, what we're going to do is we're going to say module.exports. So we're going to do a default export over here, and we're going to save this file. And if we save it, you'll see that prettier and a ESLint will take over. And we'll rename this file. And once we rename that file, we'll do the same at the top. We'll say module.exports. And we'll do this for every file. And this is just so that Node can better understand the file. The reason we initially used JSON is because it was the original format of the information, but you could just as well just export an object in a JavaScript file and it will work the exact same way. So over here, we'll change this to toronto.js and then we'll module.exports. And once we do that, we're basically good to go over here. Now that we have all of this information, what we need to do is in our places index.js, we now need to import our mocks. So we can't do an import. We need to do const mocks is equal to the require of ./mock. And then once we have our mocks, what we can do is we can say, well, how are we going to get a specific mock? Our specific mocks are Antwerp, Chicago, etc., and they're based on this longitude latitude string. Well, if we go back to our geocode request over here, what we saw in the geocode request is that we were able to get query parameters off of the URL. So how about we do the same thing? We'll do a places, we'll do a parsing, and we'll look for something called location on the URL. Now we also need to import the URL. Const URL is require URL. And once we do that, we can say location over here. So let's go take a look at what that looks like. So if we say now question mark location equals location, something like that. Well, that currently our server is probably crashing on some error. So let's go look at the terminal. And what we can see is that export const mock images is currently breaking, which is why this should be const. And once we do that, we can just restart our function here. And once we restart that, we can reload here and we can say location equals location. And then we can say some location. And we can see that we're rendering out the query parameter. Now, once we have that query parameter, what we can do over here is we can go inside of here and we can say, well, then return me mocks of the location. And when we do that, if I do this for some location, obviously I'm not going to get anything. But if I go over here to the index and I copy this and I put this as the location, well, now I'm getting information back because this matches the information that is required as the key of the information. If I change this to san and I just said save and I did over here san, let's say location and then empty and I did san, well, now the key is san, so it's going to load that key. So now the location is going to be a longitude, latitude, comma separated. Great. Now that we have that working, there was one more thing that we needed to do. Over here in our service, when we did our transform, we were changing the photos of the restaurants in the results. So let's take that away because that's a very specific change that we should be doing on the server for the mocked information. And what we'll do is we'll say module.exports.add mock images is equal to taking in the restaurant. And then we'll say that it does restaurant.photos. Instead of doing a map here, we're just going to return one singular array. And we'll do this. We'll remove this. That should do it for us, I believe. Now, this one closes that one. Remove that. And now we have restaurant.photos is equal to a specific mock image. Const random image. Let's do this. A bit more readable. And we'll say that restaurant photos is equal to some random image. And then we'll return the restaurant itself. Now what we can do is we can go inside of our function and we can say that const data is equal to the mocks location. And we can say data.results is equal to data.results.map. And then we'll say add mock image. Now, is that what I specifically called it? We'll say add mock image. So then what we'll do is we'll import add mock image. And once we do that, we'll do response.json of data. So now we overrode data results and we made sure that we add the mock image in case we need it. Okay, so now if I reload this, what's going to happen? Well, let's go ahead and restart our emulators. And once we do that, what I can do is reload here and it says cannot read property results of undefined. So we should only do this if data is available. So if we have data, then we'll do this. And then if we refresh, that should work. So let's go grab a longitude, latitude, and we'll grab Antwerp and we'll put that in. And what we can see here is that foodies is now being put in as the image. Okay, so with all of that, do you think our app will just work out of the box? Have we migrated it properly? Well, let's go reload over here and let's see. So finish geocode and then, we still need to implement the service call here. We don't have a request happening. So let's go over here and let's take the same thing that we did over here. And let me show you how simple this is. We'll do a fetch, but instead of to geocode, we'll do it to places nearby. And we'll say that the city location is equal to location. And by doing this now, what we're able to see is that our app works with mock data that is now coming from the server. So we've moved all of our mock information. All of that is now a server call. It is coming specifically from the API. Now, another thing that we should probably do if we're going to do this is over here in our location service, what we did is we have a console log here. And in our context, I believe that in one of these requests, either the restaurants or something else, we put a set timeout around the request, which we shouldn't do anymore because we did this because we were trying to emulate it loading from a server. Now that it is loading from a server, we shouldn't do that anymore. And what we can see here is that we'll have instant returns. It's still loading. It's a bit slower than just getting it locally because it's getting it from the Firebase function that's running locally, but it's still pretty fast. So if we go to Antwerp here now, we'll see it loads for half a second, and then we get our mock information back. And just like that, all of our services have been migrated to a Firebase function that can now be deployed.